All right, looks like we're live. Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. Today, I'm with Matthew McManus. Hey, Matt, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be back. I was enjoying our chat earlier.
All right, so guys, if you remember, I had a conversation with Matt, I think around a year ago, maybe almost a year ago, where we had discussed, at that time, Matthew had come up with a series of articles where he had critiqued Jordan Peterson's analysis of what postmodernism is. And following that up, Matthew had come up with what he calls postmodern conservatism. We had an amazing conversation then. If you guys have not checked that out, I will recommend that you guys go and check that out too. But after that, obviously, at that time, Matthew was in the process of writing his book. So finally, Matt has written his book. It is called The Rise of Post-Modern Conservatism, Neoliberalism, Postmodern Culture, and Reactionary Politics. So, Matt, my first question to you is, why did you decide to write this book? What was going on in your head when you decided, okay, I need to look at this subject and I need to write a book on it?
That's a very good question. And I guess it goes back to 2016 when I was wrapping up my PhD thesis at York University, which you know well, of course. At the time, I was planning on, after my postdoctoral work, just producing a very long, dense tract on legal philosophy that would probably be read by 5 or 10 people who are specialists in the field. And I still plan on doing that someday. But like a lot of people, I was really galvanized, first by Brexit and then by the election of Donald Trump. And I kind of caught myself personally noting that I had this sense that something dramatic was occurring, right? That you couldn't really fit this into the boxes of ordinary political analysis that I had relied upon, certainly since I was probably 12 years old and I started to take politics seriously. And so that just kind of left the question in the back of my mind, right? What's different about this? What's going on? But I didn't really pay that much attention to it until, of course, I completed my PhD. I was really appalled by some of the efforts that the Trump regime was taking, particularly to discriminate against Muslims, to discriminate to a certain extent against LGBTQ people, and the rhetoric that was invoked quite consistently. And what also really surprised me was the style of politics, this heavy reliance on hypermodern media, the effacement of traditional standards of truth. And around 2017, when I was working for the Committee for International Justice and Accountability, I decided to start going back and reading some of the classics of philosophical conservatism to try to get some answers, right? Is this a novel development? Is it something that has roots in the past? And what I noted when I was going through Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France was that Burke sat there and started talking about intellectual elites who were disconnected from the ordinary people, who had all these abstract ways of looking at the world, and they shouldn't be trusted with political power. And I thought to myself, this isn't really all that different from what you see many of these right-wing populists invoking. Obviously, Burke is a lot more articulate and sophisticated in his account, but the basic premise is the same. And so I started writing up my first article on the subject matter, which was published in Philosophical Salon back in December 2017, just talking about the kind of genealogy of postmodern conservatism in the classics of conservative thought. And I received a lot of angry emails, as you might imagine, and a lot of interested emails, actually, including from some conservatives, I should point out, who had said to me, this is an interesting way of looking at this. I never would have thought that about our doctrines, but maybe there is some connection between our outlook and what we see. Usually these are people who are critical of Trump, right? And this encouraged me to kind of take this a little bit more seriously. So when I came to Tech de Monterey in 2018, I started producing a series of essays, some of which you read, on the subject matter. And I was eventually offered a book contract with Paul Gray Macmillan because the editor of a series of classical liberalism called Leslie Marsh really liked one of the essays that I produced. And then, of course, it was game time. I was like, man, I really have to take this seriously now. And so I kind of hunkered down for about 8-9 months, did as much research on the history of conservatism, neoliberalism, contemporary society, and postmodernity as I could. And the fruits were the book that was published last month, along with another book that's coming out with Zero, hopefully later this year, maybe early 2020. It's a collection of essays called What is Postmodern Conservatism? Essays on our hugely tremendous times.
All right, so let's start with this. So you actually, in your second chapter of the book, you have a very interesting chapter where you try to distinguish postmodernism as a philosophy and postmodernism as a culture. Now, could you talk a little bit about that? How do you distinguish the two, and why do you think the two are different?
Well, it's a really good question, right? And obviously, the relationship between theory or philosophy and culture is one that has a long, contentious history of its own, right? For somebody like Hegel, right, philosophy is the culture of its time or the thought of its time, embodied in reflective thought. And to some extent, I see postmodern theory as falling into that paradigm. But just to explain very briefly, right, what I call postmodern theory is the kind of epistemically skeptical approach to knowledge, but especially approach to language that you see in the writings of people like Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, in some of his periods, Lyotard, and other authors in the same vein. Actually, this includes people like Gayatri Spivak, who also draws quite a bit on Hindu philosophy. You might be interested in her. But distinct from postmodern theory, I think it's also appropriate to talk about postmodern culture, which is a much more broader category. And there are various theorists who have talked about this as well, including some on the right. You've had people like Patrick Dedeen or Peter Lawler, who are conservatives who at least take the idea somewhat seriously, even though they don't always necessarily use the term postmodern culture. But there's also a lot of left-wing criticisms of the same topic or analyses of the same topic in the work of people like David Harvey. Frederick Jameson is probably the most important, the late Mark Fisher. And what all these people argue is that postmodernity is a kind of cultural condition that's shaped by various different factors underpinning highly developed societies. And it generates a unique way of looking at the world that many of the inhabitants of postmodern culture share, particularly the sense that traditional sources of identity formation have been destabilized. It's now up to us to decide who it is that we want to be. We don't need to rely on traditions anymore. We don't need to rely on religion anymore. And in some ways, a lot of the theorists of postmodern culture will say this can be very emancipatory, right? On the one hand, you're now free from tradition and culture and religion to try to shape your identity as you see fit. But on the other hand, it can be an extremely alienating feeling, right? Because now you're constantly posed the question, who are you? What do you want to be? What values do you hold on to? And there's no sources that you can turn to that can answer those questions for you. To some extent, you have to answer them for yourself, which of course can be quite disquieting.
Okay, but here's the thing. When we actually talk about postmodernism or postmodern culture, at least for the average Joe on the street, at least in the post-Jordan Peterson era, whom you have criticized, in probably a series of articles now.
And we have a book coming out soon, fortunately.
Yeah. So there you go. You're going to write a book on him too. So their understanding is this is what postmodern culture or postmodernism as an ideology is, that there is no sense of truth. Everything is relative. There is no real truth when we look at things objectively. And there is this left-wing progressive ideology that is pushing us towards the brink of nihilism, right? That's the standard version on the street. Now, why did you find that version on the street problematic per se? Because if we were to be honest, Matt, and if we look at a lot of statements made by left-wing ideologues on television sets or on podcasts, I do find that sometimes they do tend to actually give a caricature of what Jordan Peterson is actually presenting it to be. So what were your exact problems, if we were to be very precise, with the version Jordan Peterson was presenting?
Well, I can certainly understand that, right? When I was working for a charity, a women's charity back in 2016, my supervisor had a very nice phrase, right? She said, the problem with cliches isn't that they're never right, it's that they're not the whole truth. Right, and it's not hard to find any number of individuals who kind of fit the caricature of anything that you're thinking about, right? These cliches emerge from somewhere. And one of the things that I point out in my book is, of course, there are left-wing identity politics movements that embody the characteristics that people like Jordan Peterson criticize. And You can have different opinions about them. I tend to look upon them more favorably than Peterson does, or probably you. But what I also insist is that we have to ask ourselves why this particular kind of politics emerged at this time period. Right? It didn't emerge in a cultural vacuum. There's a reason why people see identity politics as the way to mobilize in order to achieve their objectives in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And the argument I make is that there are different roots to the culture that produces identity politics. There are economic roots, there are socio-political roots, and then there are also deeper roots that go back in the history of liberalism that, for instance, focus on an expressivist ethic where each individual is supposed to be free of social norms in order to find themselves as they see fit. And I say, unless we actually look at all these things and take them seriously, we'll never actually be able to understand this in a robust way, which is why I criticize Peterson and others, because I think that they just say, well, the whole reason this emerged is because the collapse of Marxism as a grand narrative, and leftists just turned to postmodern theories that were readily available and started agitating on behalf of LGBTQ people, women, and so on and so forth. And I just don't think that's a very accurate picture of what actually happened.
All right. Another thing which we were discussing before we started the podcast was that when you try to map the history of postmodernism, you start from the existentialists, which is you have Heidegger or you have Wittgenstein or the other existentialist philosophers, and then you gradually go into Derrida and Foucault. Now, as a humble student of philosophy myself, now I had a slight problem with that, where I think if we start bracketing the existentialists with Foucault and Derrida, we could run into some epistemological problem. We might have, because I mean, what was the existentialist claim at the end of the day? The existentialist claim was what? When, let's take the example of Dasein, as I was mentioning it offline to you, that, what do the existentialists say? That, when you come into this world, you don't literally come into, from a zero starting point. You're actually, kind of hopping onto a moving train. So you're never really, in a very weird way, actually, existentialists should say you're never a blank slate, to be very honest. I mean, if you look at it from the existentialist claim, you can never be a blank slate, because if you're hopping onto a running train, you're part of a running system with certain a priori assumptions which are assumed for you on your behalf by that running system. But when we look at Foucault and Derrida, that's not what they really talk about. With Foucault and Derrida, it's a categorical statement that it's entirely subjective, till the extent that I personally believe, whatever I have read of Foucault and Derrida, that it goes into complete nihilism. Now, tell me where I've understood it wrong.
Well, I certainly wouldn't say that you've understood it wrong, right? I mean, the existential tradition is a very rich tradition. There are a lot of different authors within it, and even within each author's oeuvre, you can find different lines of thought that can lead you to different political conclusions. One of the ones that you invoked, Heidegger, right, is a good example. A lot of beatniks and left-wing people like Heidegger because of his emphasis on authenticity. But of course, as you know, Heidegger himself became a fascist with a very different kind of interpretation of his own work. And I think that's what the point the genealogy that I draw there is trying to make. It's not that there's a clear line you can make where existential thought led to postmodern thought, even in its kind of more academic theoretical orientations. My point is that there are elements within existential theory that became attractive to postmodern theorists and were appropriated by them and developed in different ways. One of the ones that you mentioned, of course, Heidegger, certainly he emphasized, for example, that we're all thrown into the world, into various social contexts, and we need to understand them and recognize that our values and our ways of life are often determined by these different contexts. But of course, Heidegger also spoke a great deal about authenticity, the problem with the modern world, the collapse of a certain kind of individualism into the they, into das Man, as he sometimes calls it. And you certainly see echoes of that orientation in Michel Foucault's work, right? And the idea that society is highly disciplinary, it quashes individuality, and what we need is emancipation from this development. Another aspect of Heidegger's thought that influenced somebody like Jacques Derrida, of course, is this idea that what we need to do is deconstruct the history of Western metaphysics. Because, of course, Heidegger claims that the advent of nihilism is an inevitable product of the history of Western thought. He's not saying that it's some kind of aberration from Western thought. And so Derrida, who to some extent, considered himself a successor to this project, as some ways trying to deconstruct the history of Western thinking about presence and being and so on and so forth, to try to resuscitate some sense of meaning in the morass that Heidegger left us. And I agree with you. I don't think that he did a very good job of recovering some sense of meaning and truth and significance. But I don't think the project is as inexorably or joyfully, I should say, pessimistic as sometimes people claim, right? I don't think that these people were operating in a philosophical vacuum, and I don't think they were all either operating in a cultural vacuum, right? The Second World War had just occurred. Western nations had torn themselves apart and committed the Holocaust. I think it's inevitable that in this time period, you're going to see people take a much more cynical look at their own traditions and the history of their thinking.
Okay, now let's get into what I found was to me the most interesting aspect. To me, the meat hypothesis that you have presented in this book is that, according to you, postmodernism by itself, conceptually, is a very natural outcome of neoliberal politics and neoliberal philosophy. Now, can you explain that aspect? Because to me, that was the most fascinating aspect of the book. I was like, I never looked at it that way. And I was like, that's a good point, that if you look at it, as a progression of neoliberalism, it could end up into postmodernism. But could you explain that? Where did you come from?
Of course. I should point out that was the most difficult chapter of the book by far. I probably spent as much time writing chapter 3 as the entire rest of the text. I plan on returning to this topic at some point or another because I think that there's still a lot left to be mined there. So what appeared in that book, I wouldn't say is my last word on the subject matter. But very briefly, one of the things that I mentioned is that to understand neoliberalism, of course, you need to look at the history of liberalism, which I plan on taking a look at quite shortly, right? And one of the things that liberalism consistently emphasized is the need for the individual to be extricated from particularly traditionalist and religious systems of oppression, right? And you find this in the work kind of implicitly people like John Locke, but it certainly becomes quite a bit more overt by the time you get to people like Voltaire, by the time certainly you get to people like J.S. Mill, down to the present day. And underpinning certainly the romantic liberals of the 19th century, as my friend Galen Watts puts it, is an expressivist ethic, right? The idea that only when you are liberated from the confines of tradition and oppression can you express your true self, right? And of course, there are roots there that you can see generating nowadays into the various forms of identity politics movements and the idea, right, that conventions discriminate against LGBTQ people, refrain them from expressing their true self, in particular their true sexual orientation. So that's one of the things that I stress, right? That we need to understand that this has deep roots in the liberal tradition. What makes neoliberalism unique in particular, and its contribution to postmodern culture, is the way that it operated to commodify different spheres of life that for a long time were considered insulated from the confines of the market. And I'll give you a good example, our personal life, right? So once upon a time, traditional liberals would say that there has to be the strong demarcation from your public appearance and who you are in your private life. But of course, with the advent of internet and other hypermodern technologies, we've become much more concerned about social and personal capitalization, right? So I now use my personal life and express it in various online medias as a way to market myself, to market my work, to demonstrate that I have a certain kind of personality that messes with other demographics that might also be interested in whatever product I'm happening to sell. And that's something that even earlier liberals would consider quite shocking, right? The idea that you go on Twitter and post pictures of your girlfriend and post pictures of you on vacation, while at the same time saying, buy my book or whatever it happens to be. And it's very much a product of neoliberal culture. And I don't want to entirely denigrate it, right? I mean, I use social media, I'm quite active on it and all that stuff. But it is worth noting that when you adopt this perspective that social capitalization is important, what you run the risk of doing, of course, is not necessarily engaging in reflective activities about what your true values are, so much as presenting yourself and even your deepest inclination as a tool to market, right? And to cater to the fluctuating desires that you find in the commodity sphere. And I sometimes think that that's quite dangerous, particularly when it comes to politics. And I think it's why it's no coincidence that you see people like Boris Johnson or Donald Trump changing their political orientations, sometimes online very overtly, depending on what they think the people want at any given time.
All right. So a natural corollary to that would be then that, all right, we get it that with the advent of neoliberalism and the focus on the individual as a unit, the person as a unit, which leads to, hyper consumerism, etc., etc. We know the cascading effects of the individualism that comes from neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
But then why would it lead to, let's say, the relativism, the rampant relativism that is inside postmodern philosophy itself? Why would we connect that? Because I certainly don't see relativism in neoliberal philosophy. Neoliberal philosophy is basically about, I think the crux of neoliberalism has always been the freedom aspect of how we go about living our life. Now, I certainly don't see neoliberalism saying that there is no truth. Although you could counter me and say, what was it, John Stuart Mill, who believed in the blank slate himself, right? Or was it John Locke? I don't remember, either or.
That was John Locke, tabula rasa.
Yeah, tabula rasa. So I keep mixing the names up. So you could counter me by saying that, one of the neoliberal philosophers, their core belief was that we are a blank slate. But then he wasn't still a relativist, right? Is my point. So how do we make that leap of faith is my question.
That's a very good question. And I think this is where you need to move away from looking exclusively at political ideology to the consequences of how these ideologies instantiate themselves in material practice, right? And this is what I'm talking about when I'm discussing how the neoliberal emphasis on freedom, particularly market freedom, sounds in some ways highly attractive in theory, right? You're allowed to do whatever you want. Everything should be determined by price without restrictions being imposed by the government, so on and so forth, right? But one of the consequences of approaching freedom from this perspective, the idea that everything should be commodified and values determined by the market, is, of course, what people choose to consume is highly predicated on their subjective preferences. And that's why I don't think it's really a coincidence that what you start to see, starting in the late 20th century and the early 21st century, is a ideological rhetoric about freedom that highly emphasizes subjective experience, and sometimes will deliberately invoke the rhetoric of the market to try to justify these positions, right? You can see this all the time, right? People will say, why are you interfering with me? I'm just doing what I want. I'm not hurting anybody. And I pay my taxes like everyone else. And I run a business. All of these kind of justificatory logics find their root in neoliberalism. What the consequence of them is, of course, becomes increasingly difficult to claim that, well, your subjective opinion about what's right or wrong and how you want to live your life are incorrect. And just because you have the money and the capacity to do so doesn't mean you shouldn't change your opinion about what it is that you're doing. So, of course, from a neoliberal standpoint, if you have the resources to live a certain lifestyle and you're not interfering with anyone else, then that's what you should do, right?
All right. So somebody actually, because now we're going to enter into the realm of postmodern conservatism. So actually, somebody on the live chat asked a very smart question. So they asked this. So what's the difference between conservatism and postmodern conservatism? So let's start with that. What do you think is the key difference between the two?
Well, that's a very good question. And one of the things that I think we have to say is that conservatism, like leftism or liberalism, isn't a monolith, right? There are many different iterations of conservatism out there, some of which are more amenable to what I call mutation under postmodern conditions than others. So, for instance, I think religious conservatism, sincere religious conservatism, hasn't mutated into a postmodern variant, precisely because religious conservatives do tend to be committed to a very strong theory of universal truth, right? Religious universal truth. And so they're not going to adopt the kind of strategic skepticism that you see on the card of postmodern conservatives. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is the genealogy of postmodern conservatism goes back to the critique of rationalism that you see in people like Edmund Burke, but especially in the work of people like Joseph de Maistre, who would say things like, there's no way of rationally establishing what it is that people should do. What they need to do instead is have faith in their traditions and conventions, and in particular to submit to authority that concretizes those traditions in practice. And I say, if you look at that, that's quite a relativistic standpoint in some senses, right? But this isn't postmodern conservatism per se. It just demonstrates that there are roots in the conservative tradition that are amenable to mutation under the right conditions. And what I say occurred now is these various kinds of traditionalist conservatism and irrational conservatism have found their way onto the internet and new hyper-modern media, where they've imbibed a lot of these cultural tropes, and they now use them strategically in order to try to defend a very similar outlook to what you saw people like de Maistre defending earlier. The idea that Western liberal rationalism, with its universalistic pretensions, isn't justifiable, is propagated by elites who have their own interests, and there's really no way of deciding what the right way of living is, except through looking at your traditions, where you grew up in, the values that were propagated in your community. And since there's no way of deciding which one of these two is better, we're just going to stick with what we know best, which is the traditions, the prejudices, so on and so forth.
See, actually, that's a wonderful point you make, and I can kind of relate to it from the point of view of an Indian's experience, and I'll tell you how I can relate to it. I completely see the relativism a lot of times. So this is my understanding, and correct me if I've gotten it wrong. See, we've had the Enlightenment, and then we have the scientific revolution, and especially the post-Darwinian world, especially after the publishing of the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. There has been, if I use the word quantum leap here with full responsibility, but I think there has been a quantum leap in our understanding of the nature of reality by itself, and the kind of challenges that old school traditionalistic views about the nature of the world that we've seen probably in the last 150 to 200 years it's actually in a way shattered or shocked a large section of conservative society in general. Now, what I have noticed in my own experience in the East is that we've actually dealt with this in a very interesting way where let's use the example which I was using offline of Jainism, where Jainism, obviously, while being an atheistic philosophy, it was atheistic on the question of a creator, but it believed in the afterlife. It's very interesting, right? Here, they are actually atheists. They're atheists when it comes to, is there a God, or is there a creator, or is there a Ishwar, to use the Sanskrit term. But they certainly believed in an Atman, an essence, and that Atman keeps on reincarnating. Now, in the Indian milieu, when there was this relativism, which I see with well-read religious people too, because when they, when you like, okay, I'm a materialist, hedonistic Hindu, right? So I belong to that school. So when I question them, so they'll be like, oh, I call it the no true translation fallacy. It's the translation is never right. Now that's how so the relativism steps into the form of a no true translation fallacy here. So I do kind of relate to it, and I'm trying to understand what has happened in the West here. What I find happening in the West is there has been a humongous attack on basic Christian beliefs, or we cannot deny that Western society was not founded on Christian beliefs. I certainly don't buy that version of the left which says that Western society is not not Christianized. They say it grew out of Christianity. I say it did not necessarily grow out of Christianity. It was reacting to Christianity, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, sometimes in a very neutral way. Now the relativism, do you think this relativism actually seeps into conservatism because of the advent of science and because of the questioning at some level of core Christian beliefs?
I think that's an excellent question. And you might remember in my book, I point out that many of the theorists of postmodernism have been lax in actually looking at religious questions. So, for instance, some of the theorists of postmodernism that I admire, like David Harvey or Fred Jameson, religion is relatively absent in their work. And I think that's a serious problem, and it's something that I tried to touch on briefly in the book, and I plan on elaborating more on in the future. But I think that there are deep roots to this conflict between science and religion. And even though Western science certainly emerged, at least in part, due to Christian thought, particularly the scholastic thought of people like, say, Thomas Aquinas, the conflict between them emerges sometime around the 18th century when it becomes increasingly clear that science is challenging certain fundamental Christian mythologies. So, for instance, the idea that God created the world 7,000 years ago, or that we were a singular creation, so on and so forth. And science is so powerful, of course, at least from a practical standpoint, that as time goes on, particularly due to technological development, it becomes increasingly difficult to deny the salience of the scientific worldview, or to develop other rational ways of looking at the world that compete with science, right? Not that people happen to try. And this is, I think, relevant to postmodern conservatism, because what do you really do when rationalistic scientific worldviews, particularly when they're allied with liberal movements, seem so overwhelmingly powerful from an intellectual standpoint that you can't really develop sufficient counter arguments to undermine them? Well, one of the things that you can turn to is epistemic skepticism, or particularly strategic epistemic skepticism, right? And you see this all the time, certainly in Western discourse, right? Particularly by conservative politicians who will say, well, they can't, we can't prove the existence of God, but on the other hand, they can't firmly disprove the existence of God, right? Yeah. And from a kind of intellectual standpoint, what you want to say as well, then you have to kind of adopt a fairly neutral standpoint between these two views, right? And we have to put it on the table and consider it in more detail and ask ourselves different questions. But what postmodern conservatives will do when evoking these kind of skeptical claims is say, essentially, the liberal universalistic scientific worldview is just one way of looking at things. It has its problems, so we don't need to abide by it. What we're just going to do is stick with our religious beliefs, right? And because, science is just as predicated on faith and is just as fungible and valuable as our beliefs, there's no reason why we should prefer the one over the other. And I find this extremely difficult to deal with, right? Because to a certain extent, from an argumentative standpoint, you can really be skeptical about everything if you choose to be, right? And it can become almost impossible to argue with somebody who's just not going to accept any kind of argument for a given position. Will just always, adopt a cynical disposition towards it, right?
All right, so this has nothing to do with your book, but I have to ask this question because I cannot control myself right now. So do you think a lot of this skepticism has also seeped into this whole climate change is fake to this mindset? Because I find a lot of similarities in the arguments about climate change too. When you listen to conservatives in the West, they say, climate change is fake, science cannot answer a lot of things. Do you think that is also a typical trait of a postmodern conservative?
Yes, I'd say so. Actually, I have an article about climate change that should be coming out fairly soon, which discusses this. And I think it has deeper mythological roots than even that I'd be happy to talk about. But in the arguments about climate change, you see a lot of this kind of strategic skepticism being used to disprove scientific arguments associated with liberalism, agitating for reforms to ameliorate the worst impact of man-made climate change, right? That, well, the scientists don't know what they're talking about. They've been mistaken before. How can we actually know what's going on with something as complicated as the climate? And of course, these aren't done in good faith to try to actually ask questions, even though this is sometimes what advocates protest, right? It's done to try to suggest that you have your way of looking at things, I have my way of looking at things, and I'm going to stick with what I'd rather believe, right? Which is what climate change deniers tell me, and so on and so forth. And again, it's extremely difficult to argue against those kind of positions because these people aren't going to accept any kind of knowledge-based argument for why it is that climate change or man-made climate change might be occurring, since they've been primed, particularly through different media outlets, to just look at anything that you put forward, not just with skepticism, I should say, but also with the sense that the only reason you're propagating this is because you belong to a certain background, you're an intellectual or an elite from the media or whatever, so I don't have to listen to you.
All right, so now let's get into whom you've called postmodern conservatives. Obviously, so you've used 5 examples. Obviously, you've used Donald Trump and in the United States of America. You have Brexit in the United Kingdom. Then you have Poland, Hungary, and Italy. Now, here is my question to you. Now, if we were to look at it from a postmodern point of view, from a theoretical perspective of a postmodernist, postmodernism is actually the antithesis to homogenization, basically. I mean, if you were to bring postmodernism to its core ideological base, the world can never be homogenized. So how do we present a hypothesis where we've actually homogenized 5 different countries in this way? Do you see what I'm trying to say? I mean, your proposal is that all 5 examples fit into a natural postmodern conservative argument. But don't you think it self-defeats in a way where if we are looking at it from a postmodern lens, there can't be any homogenization at an intellectual level?
That's a very good question. And one of the things I should state is, of course, I'm not a postmodern theorist, right? So I dispute that, so I don't have necessarily a methodological problem with talking about these kind of groupings, right? At the cultural level, the way that I would answer that is postmodern conservatism is a reaction against postmodern culture, right? While at the same time being a product of it. And this is one of the reasons why I say postmodern conservatism has serious tensions inherent within it that it's unlikely to be able to resolve, right? Because on the one hand, it's reacting against the pluralistic, nihilistic skepticism of postmodernity, while at the same time adopting many of the same tropes, tactics, and political orientations, right? So there's serious questions there about how you can deconstruct the master's house with the master's tools if you happen to be a postmodern conservative, right? Can you embrace a strategic skepticism while at the same time saying people need to believe in universal truths again, particularly traditionalist universal truths again, right? Can you sit there and try to agitate against the advent of identity politics while at the same time placing so much emphasis on national identity, religious identity, sometimes racial identity, gender identity, you name it, right? And I personally don't think that postmodern conservatism is able to reconcile those tensions, except by trying to continuously present itself as opposed by a group that's responsible for all the problems, right? And this is what I talk about in chapter 4 when I discuss why postmodern conservatism is an agonistic philosophy or outlook, right? So rather than saying the roots of the problem lie in postmodern culture, of which we ourselves are a product, what they try to do is deflect this and say that the actual roots of the problem are these left-wing groups who are responsible for all the difficulties, and if we just get rid of them, everything will be fine. And this is, I think, why even when postmodern conservatives come to power and they have the chance to initiate their agenda, because they're just a reaction and they can't actually change the cultural conditions that they find themselves in, they continuously have to develop new enemies or suggest that the left is still omnipresent and dominating things in order to justify why so few things have actually changed for their supporters.
But okay, let me try and push back on this and criticize the left here. Don't you think a lot of the reaction that comes from the right wing in the West, because if I look, I'm going to give you the outsider's perspective, right? I'm an outsider sitting in India, looking at the West, listening to, let's say, Pod Save America, which is a very left-wing progressive podcast, very pro-Obama. And then I listen to, let's say, a Ben Shapiro or a Dave Rubin or a Sam Harris, who I won't say is right-wing at all. I think Sam Harris...
got a weird situation, right?
Yeah, he's got a weird situation going on for him. But nonetheless, he's a scholar. So when I listen to them, what I feel, this is my analysis, and you could completely disagree with it. I think on a cultural level, I think the left won. It's actually won. What has happened now is that the left wing, I think after winning, is what I say, they're going through this this phase where they really don't know what to do after they've won. This is my analysis. They've kind of run out of issues, in my view. So they're doubling down on whatever they get. On the other hand, you have these conservatives. The conservative vote bank, at least in America, is your typical white, married couple having kids, in the non-coastal areas, basically. That's where the Republican vote bank lies pretty much now. There is this, they know it's inevitable, the demography is going to change in America. I mean, we can just look at data and it's quite clear. I'm not saying it's a bad thing or a good thing. I'm staying agnostic to it. I could care less. I mean, and to be very honest, I think the American dream has always been about a set of values, not the color of your skin, if you go by the conservative version. So I think their worry about...
I would agree, actually. At its best, right? That's what America is supposed to stand for.
Yeah, and it's funny because the conservatives, at least the liberal conservatives, sell that. So I kind of find their worry about, the worry in conservatism about the change in demography actually kind of self-defeating for them. But having said that, I feel at times the left has won. And do you think, beyond a point, chastising the conservatives all the time is also equally responsible for the rise of this reactionary postmodern conservatism?
Well, that's a very good question, and actually, I think we need a whole other podcast to really discuss the left, broadly. But just very briefly, I would say that what you saw with the rise of the new left, starting in the 1960s and really picking up steam in the 1980s, is indeed a shift to cultural issues, right? And the idea that what we want to do is ensure that individuals from a variety of different backgrounds are capable of equal political and social participation without discrimination or marginalization, right? And in some ways, that project, as I point out in the book, was quite successful, right? Within a couple of decades, you saw states moving from adopting fairly draconian policies towards LGBTQ people, towards sometimes actually trying to embrace LGBTQ rhetoric, what's sometimes called pink washing in the circles. And I think the same is true with the civil rights movement and various rights movements to try to include people from different ethnic backgrounds. There's still a long way to go in some countries, it depends on them, but a lot of achievements were made, and I think that's something to be praised. Where I think the left faltered was on the attainment of economic and redistributive efforts. So I think the sense that many conservatives have is that conservative policies won when it came to the economy and wealth redistribution and so on and so forth through the implementation of neoliberalism, whereas the left won many cultural victories, right? And personally, the way that I feel is we didn't appreciate how this combination of rapid cultural change with economic inegalitarianism generated the conditions for new kinds of movements to emerge. The one that I talk about is postmodern conservatism, but where I personally align myself is with the desire for greater redistributive efforts and a reorientation of the left back towards emphasizing greater democracy and greater economic equality. And I think that that's what you're seeing also with the rise of people like Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, particularly in the United States. You're also seeing a movement to some extent towards more left-wing parties in Canada. You see AMLO, for example, emerging in Mexico. So I think you're starting to see, oddly enough, a shift back to older concerns on the left. Partly as a reaction against the rise of postmodern conservatism, but also, of course, it gives a reaction against about 40 years now of neoliberal austerity and anti-democratic agitation. And I see this as a positive development that might give the left a new focus after orienting itself so long on cultural issues surrounding participation.
All right, so then let's close things with this aspect that you're talking about. Obviously, because you raised this in the final chapter of the book where you talk about an egalitarian agenda for the future. Mm-hmm. Now, here's where I come from. Right now, I'll tell you why I've always been pro markets. Mm-hmm. I come from a poor country. Mm-hmm. My father was actually a very poor man. My father, I distinctly remember growing up in a household that was very lower middle class. Mm-hmm. And from that, obviously in the 1990s, India opened up its markets, and a lot of good things have happened for India after 1990s, 1992, when the Narasimha Rao Congress government actually for the first time opened the markets. And since then, there has been a consistent stand of most governments about, a lean towards, I would not say a completely free market economy, but a redistributive economy, which is kind of here, kind of there, where we have the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi actually declaring a kind of a healthcare scheme for millions of people who are below a certain poverty line or below a certain financial scale. And it's working, which worries people like me, not because of it being a bad thing, where, the standard question a person like me would ask is, where's the money going to come from? So that's what worries me. Where I look, because I've read a lot of your articles too, where you've kind of, explained this. In fact, in the book, you say, I will develop on this later on, because you've actually kept it in a very concise and a very precise way. But when you say an egalitarian agenda, and you know me, I have disagreed with you on this subject many times, but is there really something like egalitarianism that we can achieve actually?
That's a very good question, right? And what I want to talk about, just to clarify, is that I'm not agitating for strict egalitarianism, right? That all people should be equal. My perspective, drawing on people like John Rawls or the Indian economist Amartya Sen, is for fair equality, right? And this is one of the ways that I push back against people who will say the only thing that we should be concerned about isn't necessarily inequality or fairness. It's just improving standards of living for all, right? That poverty is being ameliorated, or at the very least, it's not getting worse in many areas of the world, and that at least a significant portion of the world's population is getting more affluent. And I certainly have a lot of sympathy for those kind of positions, right? I think that the staggering decreases in poverty that you've seen in many parts of the developing world over the last 30 years are reason to be very optimistic, right? I live in Mexico right now, and you can see the impact of that on many people, including my wife's family, and it's something that I'm extremely grateful for. But people aren't just concerned with whether or not a significant part of the population's quality of life is improving. They're also concerned with things like fairness, right? And fairness is a different moral concern than just what's sometimes called welfare maximization. And the reason I think you see many people turning to people like AMLO or Sanders or Warren, or even for that matter, many of the right-wing populists who invoke a little bit more of an economically redistributive agenda, is precisely because they feel that many people have gotten ahead through no virtue of their own, whereas a lot of people are left behind, even though they work very hard and they struggle quite a bit. And I don't necessarily think that that's something that is irrational, per se. I think that many of us have an instinctual desire for society to be fair. And I usually give my students a fairly typical example, right? Imagine, both of you were to come to work at my house, and I told you that I'm going to pay you at the end of the day, and you both did the same amount of work and put the same amount of effort into everything, but I paid one of you $50, and then I paid the other one $25, and I said, well, the reason I'm doing this is because I just happen to like the person I gave $50 to better, right? In those circumstances, I made both of these people better off, and so you might say, just from the standpoint of somebody who, say, talks about poverty reduction in absolute terms, that what do you have to complain about, right? Everyone's better off in this circumstance. The situation has been optimized. But I think the person who got $25 would be right in saying, well, hold on, right? That there's something weird about this, right? I did the same amount of work. I committed the same amount of effort. Why is someone being rewarded far more than I am, right? And I don't think it's irrational for those people to say, we want to renegotiate the parameters of this deal to establish something that's more fair and equitable for all of us. And that's what I'm talking about at the end of the book, right? Not strict fairness, or not strict equality in the sense that everyone gets the same, but fairness, where people are awarded more consistently with what they actually put in, rather than just, for instance, let's say the market values, or what people are able to inherit for arbitrary reasons.
But the counter to that would be that the moment we get the state involved in ensuring what you call is fairness it could lead to a situation where the companies or the job generators who are supposed to be delivering this fairness that we want to be achieved would actually it could have an adverse effect on it. Like I can't share the studies with you, but I'll definitely send them across to you. I came across a couple of interesting studies where how actually eventually minimum wage has an opposite effect on employment in many cases. Now personally, I'm not against minimum wage. I want to clarify this up front, but the point is that I read those studies and I was like, okay, so maybe I am wrong, or I don't know. I mean, instinctively, yes, my mind and my heart, as they say, would want a minimum wage. We would want these things, but the point is, it all boils down to the efficiency, as I always say, which is the most efficient method. And I have noticed that you've been critical of Steven Pinker's analysis, where I have been actually very, very supportive of Pinker's way of looking at the way the world is going, because I see the Pinker analogy every day in my country. I see things becoming better in my country. I see that prosperity in front of my own eyes in my city of Mumbai as I see things coming up, and people getting opportunities, and people getting out of the poverty daily in India. And as someone who saw this country experimenting with socialism for so many years, and this country going to the verge of bankruptcy and then coming out with free market economy, basically, I sometimes worry that the fairness you talk about could lead to dire consequences for Western nations. So tell me why my concerns are wrong.
Well, I would like to say I don't think that your concerns are wrong, right? I mean, anyone who looks at the history of the command economies, whether you're talking about the Soviet Union or Maoist China, or today North Korea or Cuba, would have every reason to be concerned about these agendas. And this is one of the points where I think the economic left hasn't done as good a job as it can in trying to differentiate itself from the earlier command economies. Do you know the YouTuber ContraPoint?
I've heard the name.
Okay. Well, she's very good, and she's a leftist, right? But she points out that if you go onto university campuses today, this is kind of speaking to what you're talking about, and talk to socialists, they'll still usually have the hammer and sickle and a big picture of Stalin or something on their shirt, and they'll argue that it's all Western propaganda, right? It wasn't as bad as people say. And when I say people like that, I'm kind of like, well, you're never going to gain a lot of traction for any egalitarian agenda if the first thing people think of is gulags and Soviet-style communism. So there really needs to be an effort to kind of move away from that kind of rhetoric and that kind of outlook. So I don't think it's wrong to be concerned. What I'm talking about in the book as an egalitarian agenda isn't a command economy, right? I think that when you approach the issue of redistributive justice, you need to be very careful to preserve things like incentive structures. And I'm certainly not in favor of the state, for example, assuming control over all national industries and running them without any competition, because I think that has the potential to lower the quality of service, in some circumstances to raise prices, and of course to create a culture of corruption, certainly in many developing states, rather like what you see here in Mexico, for example, when it comes to many public services. Where I push back against these concerns is that the only alternative that we have, therefore, to any efforts to redistribute wealth is a highly inegalitarian neoliberal economy where the private sector secures control of virtually everything, and where taxes are extremely low, there's very little regulation, and even democracy can't really do very much to interfere with the operations of the economy. So one of the things that I am interested in seeing, for instance, in many developed countries, would be a return to greater levels of unionization. Right? I think that the labor movement, particularly starting in the 1960s, but really in the 1970s and the 1980s under Thatcher and Reagan, has really suffered a lot of blows, right? And this is meant that laborers have a lot less opportunities to actually participate in their workforce in a meaningful way and to demand fair wages, where the company turns out a profit and actually, of course, the workers have an interest in the company turning out a profit, but the people at the bottom are also very well cared for, right? And I think you can see examples where such a system actually operates quite well, for instance, in the Nordic countries, or countries like Finland, where unionization has actually taken off or increased in recent years. So that's one example of where I think you can start to push for a greater egalitarian agenda through encouraging unionization without necessarily demanding something like a command economy forming.
All right, so I just want to take a few questions from the live chat. So Charan Sai, thanks for the super chat. So he's asked, any thoughts on Moldbug and neo-reactionaries? I have no clue about this, so I'm going to leave it to you.
I don't know who Moldbug is, so if they're willing to clarify, then I might be able to give a few thoughts. But
yeah, so the one question was asked by Gurinder Singh. He says, is the rise of postmodern conservatism related in any way to geographic developments? If so, what's the tipping point where it picks up pace in a demography?
Okay, that's an interesting question, right? And of course, some of the more extreme postmodern conservatives do actually pay a lot of attention to demographic factors, right? And this is where you start to see things like great replacement theory, or the idea that there's some white genocide going on in many of these different countries because, whites are being outbred. This is the rhetoric, right, by non-natives. And I think that some of these anxieties have a basis in the fact that developed countries have indeed become more pluralistic, particularly in the last 80 years. And there's a lot of different factors behind this. And it's particularly true that they become more pluralistic in urban areas that a lot of postmodern conservatives aren't comfortable with. Now, I think a lot of the concerns about demography are highly overstated, right? There's no evidence that, for instance, Native Europeans are going to become a minority on the continent anytime soon, right? I think the estimate, if current trends continues, is something like by the year 2500, there might be more Muslims than Christians on the European continent. But what I think the left needs to focus on is recognizing these anxieties about demography as stemming from a set of appreciable concerns about what it is that your state is going to stand for and what kind of people you want to be. And often these are expressed in a xenophobic way or a racist way, so I can understand why a lot of people dismiss them. But I do think the left needs to be more attentive to try to provide some people with some sense of unified identity that just goes beyond being an individual consumer who's concerned with their own self-interest and potentially the self-interest of their family.
Now, I'll give you an example, a classic example where a lot of people run into problems with left-wing, and I call it left-wing hypocrisies. I'll give you an example. I recently saw the Toronto Raptors. I mean, yeah, the Raptors won, so that's all good.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, so I just saw an interesting ad. The Raptors was showing women in hijabs playing ball, right? It was a recent ad. I mean, it's actually my friends in Canada sent me that ad, and I was like, that's interesting. Now, here's my point. Now, here you have a scenario in Iran where women are getting jailed for basically taking a hijab off, right? For them, it's a symbol of oppression. And here you have a very interesting, I don't want to use the word, but I'm going to use it. I mean, you have very interesting bedfellows in a sense where you have highly conservative, anti-LGBT, freedom of speech, conservative Islamism I'm not going to use Islam. I'm purposely using the technically correct word, Islamism. And liberal, egalitarian, freedom for all, old school left. I mean, the hippie movement, for goodness sake, the hippie movement was what? It was about, just leave us alone. We want just love. Let's. Now, I am someone who is vehemently in support of a woman's right to wear a hijab. If she wants to wear a hijab, she has every right to wear one. Yeah, we can have reasonable restrictions, like, if you're going into fly a plane or something like that, then maybe you need to take it off or whatever. I'm not saying I'm not put my mind to it, but maybe there might be somewhere where you can block a hijab. I'm certainly not for the French way, where you just can't do it at all. I don't like that way. I believe it's anti-freedom. So if you're for freedom, you can't ban the hijab too. But my thing is, the left kind of self-defeats itself when it celebrates the Toronto Raptors, because what you're celebrating is not women empowerment. In a way, you're celebrating a very suppressive kind of an ideology. So don't you think the left loses when they do these things where they're actually contradicting each other?
That's a good question, right? Just to the first point, I'd like to say that this isn't the first time where you've seen these kind of unusual political pairings emerge, right? You know what they say, politics makes strange bedfellows, right? So in the 1980s, for example, you had certain radical anti-sex feminists, people like Andrea Dworkin or Catherine McKinnon, who found themselves in occasionally odd alliances with social conservatives on the issue of pornography, right? So Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon were both highly critical of the sexualization of women in media, and of course many of the more socially conservative Reaganites were as well. So occasionally you'd see them happen to say nice things about one another, which they wouldn't on any other topic. And I think the same thing occurs now, where many leftists see cultural minorities, even from highly conservative backgrounds, as allies in the push for greater cultural pluralism and acceptance of multiculturalism and difference, right? Even if they don't share a lot more in common from the perspective of values, at least, than that. And where I will agree with you is when it comes to these kinds of strategic alliances, often there isn't a lot of intellectual energy put in to trying to actually see how it is that these groups can be the different values of these groups can be reconciled in a more organic way. And in some cases, I think that's just because they can't. And one of the things that I think people on the left and people on the right do is just decide not to try to engage in that kind of effort because it's going to be too uncomfortable. It's going to lead to too many forms of infighting. So it's better just to focus on practical political concerns rather than the bigger ideological questions of how do we reconcile these groups and their competing values together beyond just a focus on one or two practical political questions, right? So for instance, should people be allowed to wear the hijab in society and so on and so forth. And I personally think that's a mistake, right? I think that people from any political background should have the courage of their convictions and certainly the intellectual tenacity to actually try to find a way either to reconcile what seem like irreconcilable differences or to just admit that this is no more than a strategic coalition and it's probably going to break down sometime in the future, and to highlight the kind of issues that are going to need to be dealt with when the inevitable does actually occur. And I just have to say, on the hijab issue, right, I'm opposed to French-style secularism, whether it's implemented in France or it's implemented in Quebec, as now seems to be the case. I also believe that people should be allowed to wear whatever it is that they want, particularly when it comes to religious symbols that are highly meaningful in people's life. What I do oppose are the imposition of those religious symbols onto individuals who might not want to wear them because they happen to belong to a certain ethnic or cultural or religious group. And this is one of the things that I think that's virtuous about liberalism, right? That you can choose to wear the hijab if you want, and if you do, then it's a sincere expression of your religion. That's something to be celebrated. But if you choose not to, society should create the space for you to believe that community, or at least to abandon that practice if that's what you want.
Yeah, just a passing comment. I think what is happening globally, and it is actually aggravated because of social media, is where I think both the sides are equally guilty of this. I don't believe the left does it. I believe the non-left or the right wing does it too. That what we are doing is we are taking the lowest common denominator on each side. Yeah. We're using that as the example, and presenting it as the norm on social media, because we are all living in our comfortable echo chambers where everybody on the other side is a, I don't know, a freaking monster or something.
Yeah.
And that is why, I reached out. I'm so glad that, I could reach out to you. I can talk to you, and you're so approachable, because believe me, I mean, I'm pretty liberal on most things. But if I would reach out to a left-wing person in India, I'm shut out these days. I'm shut out because, well, you voted for the BJP. So what? It's just a vote. I mean, I believe in certain things. I'm pretty liberal on most things. I believe in India, the political realities are slightly different than you would want to actually understand. I mean, if you want an informed discussion, we could have it. But I see this happening, and it's actually worrying me, because social media, I believe, is now turning out into something that we need to figure this shit out. Otherwise, we're going to be in a deep, deep mess, because we are going on in these weird echo chambers where we just don't listen or read the other side. Like, one of the things that I look forward in the week is actually when you write an article on Colette, on Area Magazine, or Marian West. I actually look forward to it, because I want to know what a well-meaning, educated, progressive author wants to write and wants to say. And that's when your book came out, I immediately bought it. The next day I found out, and I was like, okay, let me read what Matt has to say. But what do you think is the way forward? How do we deal with this polarization that's happening?
Well, I'd like to say that I completely agree with what you're talking about, right? And this isn't to say that there aren't bad people on the left, and certainly not to say that there aren't bad people on the right who are genuinely racist and Nazis, right? These people do exist, and we need to be concerned about them, right? But I think that the reason why you see this kind of political polarization emerging at this point has to do with several factors. I think the biggest one is something that you already adjusted to, is the emergence of these new kind of media, right? So Neil Postman wrote a very good book, I'd strongly recommend it, called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where it talked about how many politically active people in the early 20th century and 19th century, when literacy was becoming quite common, developed their political opinions, including political opinions on the opposition, through print media, things like articles in newspapers or books or whatever it happens to be, right? And he says that the advantage of a print media is that you actually have to engage with the ideas in a fairly sustained fashion, right? If I'm reading a book on conservatism or left-wing politics, right, then I'm getting a pretty comprehensive overview of what's going on over the course of 250 pages, 500 pages, whatever, right? Whereas what's happening now with the emergence of these new media is that information is transmitted more effectively and more democratically. So he's not opposed to that, right? But he says it's problematic, of course, since these new media tend to really emphasize short, quippy, and highly efficient dissemination of information, where complexity and nuance get lost. And one of the things that he also talked about quite presciently in the 1980s is that what's also occurring is, of course, the news and media are becoming more partisan, because partisanship is easier to disseminate, and it's also more entertaining and galvanizing than nuance, right? Which is why I think you see so many political media now taking on the auspices of almost a sporting event, right? You have one team, you cheer for it, and then you have the other team, they're bad, and you have to attack them. And of course, that's highly entertaining and it's easily disseminated. It's a simple narrative that most people can understand. The problem is, of course, that that's often not true, right? The world is a much more complex place than can be summarized in 5 minutes, where there's the team you cheer for and the team you're opposed to. And I don't want to be a Luddite and say that we need to go back, of course, to print media and everyone starts to need to read books again, because that's just not going to happen, right? Although I would like people to read more books, including my book. There's my little shameless plug. But I think what people need to be doing is rather like what you're doing with this podcast, right? Digital media need to be better at engaging in long-form kind of discussions where nuanced issues can be described in some detail. You need to have people who are interested in looking at things in a rigorous way take to these new kinds of media and taking them seriously enough to use them consistently, rather than just looking to print media. And that's a difficult thing to do, right? I think that's a slow cultural shift. Although I do think there are some reasons to be optimistic, right? In the last little while, particularly on YouTube, which I follow more closely than some of these other digital media, I think you're starting to see commentators like people like ContraPoints, for example, emerge, who do look at these issues more seriously. And certainly they have an orientation, right? Everyone has an orientation and a side that they're arguing for, but they're willing to look more seriously at what the opposition is saying and try and take the points on board that they think are worth thinking about. And this is what I talk about in my article on the engaged left. I think you're starting to see leftists who are doing this. And I do think that some never-Trumpers on the political right are also starting to try to engage in similar kinds of activities of reaching out to the other side, looking at what they have to say, and trying to dialogue more effectively. Although, of course, we remain a minority, compared to all the partisan stuff that's out there. But you never get anywhere by saying, I'm just not going to try. You got to do the best you can.
Totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. We have to try because what other option do we have? So guys, I think it's time to wrap things up. I've taken more than an hour of, Matt's precious time. And so just to let all of you know, in the description of the podcast, I'm going to have the link where you can buy Matt's book on Amazon, whether you want the Kindle version or you want a hard copy. Also, I think Matt's book is available for rent too on Kindle, right, Matt? You can rent it out on Kindle?
It should be. It was the other day. It seems to go back and forth. I'm not sure why that is. But if you keep an eye on the Amazon page, I imagine it'll be available to rent again fairly soon.
All right. So guys, just check the link out. I highly recommend this book. Not only that, I'm going to leave a link to Matt's website where, he's basically put all his articles, which he has written on various platforms. To me, and I've always said it, on Twitter, if you follow me on Twitter, I've said it, he's one of my favorite progressives. I always look forward to, every article Matt writes, like, it's literally Matt posts it on Twitter. I like it. And then I'll go back whenever in my spare time, I'll actually read him because I get to know a well-meaning left-wing perspective, mainstream progressive perspective when I read him. And I think, we need to have these conversations. If we don't understand the other side, and it applies equally to the other side too, we're not, see, at the end of the day, we're stuck in this world together, whether we like it or not. We're on this little planet, whether we like it or not, and we have to deal with each other. So guys, once again, I'm going to say, go and buy his book. It's probably the best book you can buy if you want to support, good authors and good ideas. I think he makes a lot of good points in this book. I see a lot of postmodern elements in the Indian movement too. But I don't see it merely in the BJP. I think I see the entire Indian political movement actually very, very relativistic in many ways, because I sincerely don't see a lot of differences in BJP and Congress beyond a point, other than 3-4 identitarian issues. But Matt, once again, man, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure to talk to you as always.
Anytime. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it. And I hope your listeners enjoyed it also.
All right. Okay, guys, until then, I'll see you next time. As always, please support the podcast, like it, share it with others. As you know, I'm already on Patreon. You can see the link here. You can go on Patreon, support me there. There are already 2 new episodes that are already up only for Patreon subscribers. I've started this book discussion club where I go through books, complicated books, and I sit down with all of you and I try to summarize them and put the points across. So until then, namaste, take care, goodbye, see you next time.